This is Chapter 3, Section 2, Native Americans Struggle to Survive. Native Americans, they were the original inhabitants of North America. They settled in North America over 10,000 years before Christopher Columbus ever landed in the New World. They were the original people here. Um, they lived all over North America before the European settlers arrived. So it wasn't like that the North America was uninhabited and just this, land of forests and trees and deserts and everything. Like there was people here. The Native Americans were already here. Native Americans had already had well-established cultures, nations. There was a whole, country full of people before the colonists arrived. So this map's showing you how the Native Americans came to North America. They were actually from Asia, and it actually came in separate waves. As you can see, the first migration, second migration, how they came over. And there was, so right here, I think this next map, nope, this was an ice bridge at one point between the two continents, between Russia and Alaska, and that's how they traveled over. And this was probably by boat, we're just guessing, but that's how the original people came over. And so this is just showing you like the different nations, different cultures. So like Eastern Woodlands and then the Southeast. So this would be like, the Native Americans that you think of with the Pilgrims. And then this would be the Native Americans that you think had like, Great Plains had like the teepees that we'll talk about. And the Pueblos down in the Southwest. So there are different types, different cultures, different nations of Native Americans. So pretty much when the Europeans arrived, they forced the Native Americans off their own lands. The colonists wanted to establish their colonies in the New World, but it was already inhabited, like I said. The colonists and the Europeans were able to do this by just having more advanced weaponry. They had guns versus spears and bow and arrows. It was pretty much as simple as that. Even though the Europeans were outnumbered by the Native Americans, just the sheer fact that there was guns and cannons and armor, that was just a huge advantage. Also, the Native Americans caught the deadly diseases that the Europeans were already immune to. So it was mainly smallpox, and this just decimated the Native American tribes. After the United States is created in 1776, Native Americans are continually being forced off their lands, getting less rights, and being relocated to the Western Territories. By 1830, President Jackson, he signed a bill, the Indian Removal Act, that forced 60,000 Native Americans from the southeast, like Florida, Georgia area, and to relocate them west of the Mississippi. This is why that they want President Jackson off the $20 bill, because of this terrible Indian Removal Act that he passed. It was just such a terrible thing. It's called the Trail of Tears because you're pretty much relocating all these people, moving them thousands of miles out to the west. They have no idea, about the land that they're going to. It was a terrible ride there, as you can see. It was cold. A lot of people died. It was just terrible. In 1865, there were about 360,000 Native Americans that lived out west, mainly on the Great Plains, like I stated before. So these were called the Great Plains Indians, and some of them were some of those that migrated west from the eastern coast that was part of the Trail of Tears. Now, these Great Plains Indians, they really didn't have one territory. They were migrant, meaning they moved around. They followed the herds of buffaloes, and buffaloes are really essential to their life. They used everything on the buffalo, from the meat to the bones, the hide to the sinew. They used everything. They would travel on horseback, and they would set up these teepees. Like I said, they were nomadic. They traveled around, and the teepees themselves were even made out of buffalo hide. And so they would wear the buffalo fur in the wintertime, and just everything. The bones. They made tools out of them. Everything was in their life was centered around the buffalo. So this is kind of like the Great Plains area. Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, part of Colorado, Wyoming, definitely the Dakotas. That's all the Great Plains areas. So this is a map of this time. You had, these are all established states and everything, and then this was just called Indian country. There was no states yet developed. As these miners and these railroads, like we said in the last section, they were expanding west, but the U.S. government already promised to protect Native American land. They said, okay, here's your land. When they forced them west with the Indian Removal Act, they took their land in the east and gave them some in the west. But as the United States was expanding westward, they're like, never mind. We need to take those lands too. So this Fort Laramie Treaty. These Great Plains Indians met government officials at Fort Laramie, Wyoming, and they were discussing these protections of Native American lands. So, like, the Native Americans were like, hey, you're intruding on our lands, building these railroads, mining around our lands. This is what you promised us. You moved us out of our previous area. This is supposed to be our land, and you're not even honoring that. So the agreement really was if the Native Americans would settle permanently and stop falling to buffalo, the U.S. promised to protect their lands. So really they were promised a large swath of lands where the buffaloes would roam. But they said, well, if you can take a smaller chunk of land, we'll honor that. But soon after that Fort Laramie Treaty, there was a massive gold rush that appeared in this Native American land at Pikes Peak, and these miners just began moving into the Native American territory and just throwing the treaty out the window. When there's money to be made, the treaty kind of just wasn't really honored. So the Sand Creek Massacre really is what started the Native American Wars. So like I said, like the Fort Laramie Treaty started, and other treaties were there to protect Native American land, but settlers weren't really honoring that. So Native Americans would attack supply trains and settlements and resist in giving up their lands. So this U.S. cavalry unit, I don't want to say mistakenly attacked, because they knew they were attacking this tribe of Cheyenne Native Americans. This particular group were not violent, and they even waved the white flag. But what happened was these Cheyennes were trying to be peaceful and surrendered, but these U.S. cavalry soldiers opened fire anyways and killed over 100 of these men, women, children of the Cheyenne tribe. They really just killed them in cold blood, meaning they weren't really putting up a fight or anything like that, and all of a sudden they just started open fire and killing them. The Sand Creek Massacre did start the war between the U.S. and Native Americans. It was just such an outright, just terrible incident to the Native Americans, and they really had enough. So this kind of shows, the cavalry unit coming in, and they're just shooting, this group of Cheyenne. So at first the U.S. cavalry unit were seen as heroes, and then it was discovered that hey, they were surrendering. It wasn't really a battle. So it wasn't, the leader, the commander of the cavalry unit was actually kicked out of the army and punished. So the Sand Creek Massacre is actually a National Historic Site now, and it's the only site that has the National Park site that has the word massacre in it. So after the Sand Creek Massacre, Native Americans war began. So who was fighting in this war? Well, it was right after the Civil War, and so veterans of the Civil War would fight. And they were called the African American soldiers that mainly were sent out there were called Buffalo Soldiers. These were African American soldiers that were veterans of the Civil War, and they remained in military service to fight in the Native American wars. And they were kind of distinct. They wore these blue uniforms and yellow gloves and yellow bandanas. You can see their regiment there. They were called Buffalo Soldiers because they were fighting the Native Americans that followed the buffalo, but they're a pretty famous unit. So like we said, these buffalo were just so important to the Native American way of life. At 1700, there's approximately 30 million buffalo that roam in North America. And let me just clear this up. We call them buffalo in the United States, but really they're, bison. Buffalo are more like in Africa. They're like water buffalo and stuff, but they're really bison. But we call them buffalo, so I'll just use the term buffalo. Fast forward to 1860, the mass destruction of the buffalo population really began. And really the reason is that, remember we talked about the Transcontinental Railroad was being built and crews would kill the buffalo. They were right there and there was meat there. And so you had to feed these crews of thousands of workers. So they were just, there's the buffalo, let's kill them, feed our workers. They're right there. Also, the buffalo hides themselves were considered a fashion item and they would sell at high cost for clothing. But really the main reason was that Native Americans' way of life depended so much on the resource of the buffaloes that the U.S. government was just killing them outright, so the Native Americans would lose their will to fight a war against the United States. So it's, the United States hired these people to kill these buffalo, and the United States soldiers to kill these buffalo, that some of them were killing, one man could kill 2,000 buffalo in 1 week. So these millions of buffaloes were killed in the span of like 20, 30 years. And then at one point in 1884, there was, after 30 million in North America, there was only 325 left living in North America. That's how effective the United States were at killing these buffalo. They wanted to put an end to the Native American wars. If they killed the buffalo, the Native Americans would lose all their resources and their way of life, and that's what they did. And it did work to the contributing. So without the buffalo, the Native Americans' way of life in the Great Plains just was no more. Now fast forward to the present day, talking about the buffalo, aka the bison. After major conservation efforts by the United States government, there are now 500,000 wild buffalo in the Great Plains. There's 5,000 alone in Yellowstone National Park, and those are purebred buffalo in Yellowstone National Park. A lot of them are kind of like got mixed in with wild cattle and stuff like that. But this is a picture of a bison. They're huge creatures, and there's about 500,000 left now, and that's a lot more. That's a heck of a conservation effort than starting from only 325. So now they're finally getting back in the United States. So what a reservation is that it's a land set aside for Native Americans to live on. The U.S. government would set aside this land for Native Americans to settle on, and it was supposed to be protected from American settlers from settling on this land. Like, this was supposed to be set aside for Native Americans. Fortunately, the United States never really gave the Native Americans really nice land. It was usually land that the United States really didn't care about, didn't have any gold on, wasn't rich in farmland. It was literally so a lot of land was in the Black Hills of South and North Dakota, and they're called the Black Hills, but it's also called the Badlands. It's not really farmable, but that's where a lot of Native American reservation land was. And the Sioux and Cheyenne tribes were given these lands, like I said, in the Black Hills. But like I said, it was called the Badlands. But a gold strike in those Black Hills all of a sudden happened, and settlers and miners started flooding in the area. Illegally, of course. They weren't allowed to do this. Some of the famous chiefs, it was called Chief Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, led attacks against the white settlers and the miners to keep them out. They're like, no, we had enough. This is all part of the Native American Wars. The Native American Wars wasn't like a typical war. It was pretty much these separate nations just battling back against the United States overstepping their bounds. So this is one of the most famous battles in American history, just because, I mean, it was over really quick, but it was just talked about a lot. And it has a lot of controversy to it, but it's the Battle of Little Bighorn. And so the United States military is ordered to round up all these violent and resisting Native Americans during this Native American War. They want to keep them on the reservations. So the 7th Cavalry Division of 200 men, led by George Custer, give a little background on him. He was a famous cavalry officer in the Civil War. He was at the Battle of Gettysburg. He's decorated and everything like that, but kind of had a troubled past. He got kicked out of the military, and he just had some different issues. But he was a good cavalryman and leader. But he was attacked by 1,000 Sioux warriors, and he only had 200 men at the Battle of Little Bighorn, Montana Valley. So he was just stormed. And Americans like to think that the Americans fought valiantly and greatly against the 1,000 Sioux warriors, but that really wasn't true. That was, they were just ambushed and killed really quickly. It did not last long, and all the men were killed. But when the news of this, the Battle of Little Bighorn, reached American citizens, they were outraged and they wanted revenge on the Sioux tribe. So it really backfired on the Native Americans. They won a good battle and they got United States off their lands for a little bit, but the retribution after that was just terrible. The United States was not going to take that sitting down. After the Battle of Little Bighorn, the United States had a really strong effort in defeating all Native American resistance and forcing them onto the reservations. So towards the end of the Native American Wars, you have the Battle of Wounded Knee. And this is when the U.S. cavalry surrounded the last resisting warriors of the Sioux tribe at Wounded Knee Creek, South Dakota. So you had some Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. They survived, but now they're finally, one of the last, leading the last little bit charge here. And so you can see they met these army soldiers, and it was supposed to be peaceful. They wanted to just get them back on the reservations, but a gunshot was fired, and a fight broke loose, and 200 Sioux men, women, and children died in this massacre. So just the Native Americans being so outnumbered, and after a shot fired, all the armies started shooting, and Native Americans were just killed and massacred. And that was really the last battle of the Native American War. So the United States did recognize that, we didn't treat these Native. I mean, this was their land, and all because the colonists and Europeans had better guns, didn't mean it was right to take over the land. So they tried to make some reparations, and so the government passed the Dawes Act, and this was in 1887. This was to help improve Native American life after being placed on the reservations. Under the act, each Native American would receive 160 acres of farmland. Now, did that mean it was going to be good farmland? Well, unfortunately not. But at least they had some land. And they wanted to set up schools to normalize or Americanize Native American children. And hopefully they can be successful if they learn American culture, kind of assimilate into American culture. Maybe they can have successful lives. But the Dawes Act was a failure. It reached Native Americans were resistant to the American way of life, and they wanted to keep their culture, but some of them were dying out. Big problem with Native Americans is that they developed alcoholism after depression because their whole way of life was they killed all the buffalo. They lost identity of who they were. Americans, even though the Native American Wars were over, Americans generally didn't treat Native Americans too well because they remembered, like, oh my gosh, Battle of Little Bighorn. They killed all those soldiers. They fought all these wars because they were really seen as enemies because all attacks on settlers. So they were not seen as good people. So it was really hard for them to make it in the United States. Even to the present day, the United States government is still trying to support Native Americans, but for everything the United States has caused them, all the wrongdoing, this was their land, we took it over, and we gave them bad land and forced them on these reservations and killed all their buffalo, and really destroyed their culture. So even today, we're trying to make up for it. But Native American reservations are still one of the poorest and most destitute places in the United States. There's just extreme poverty. It seems like the Native Americans really never rebounded from their culture and got their culture back, even on reservations where they can really do what they want. There's just a lot of unemployment and just not a great place in the United States. So you can see, they don't live the greatest, kind of government housing, just trying to make it work. They just don't, there's not like a lot of industry or anything on these reservations. They're not like, as you can see, it's not the greatest farmland. So there's just not a great area for them to earn any money. One way that they have tried earning money is at these, have you ever heard of a Native American casino? And at these casinos, really on these reservations, they have their own laws and they have their own police. So at these, these casinos can get away with a little bit of craziness, and they can make some money there. But that's really, not a great way of making money. But that's one way they found some success is having these casinos. So that concludes chapter of Native Americans.